Hey, I'm Nick, and I'm going to show you how I built this oak and leather stool. But before we get too far into that, just a little bit of background. This is a reimagining of the first build I filmed for YouTube. That one was made of 2x4s and built for a challenge put on by the Modern Maker podcast. I always felt that the original was a little too chunky and didn't really embody the essence of the design I had intended. But anyway, on with this new build. The first thing I'm doing is just laying out all of the pieces on this 10-foot red oak 1x4. So here's the general layout I went with. I tried to be as efficient with material as I could without making things more difficult than they needed to be. This allowed me to cut the pieces to more manageable lengths so that they'll fit in my taper jig on the table saw. Speaking of that jig, it's just a very simple jig that I put together for a previous project. It works surprisingly well, so I haven't bothered to upgrade it yet, but I'm sure that'll be coming in the future. With the tapers cut, it's time to cut the angles on the tops and bottoms of each leg. For this, I set my protractor to the appropriate angle for each end, marked them, and then cut them. So at this point, the major pieces are cut, and they are the footrest or lower stretcher, the lower legs, the seat sides, and finally, the main legs. And now, we're ready to assemble a few of them. The first parts to get glued together are the lower stretcher and the lower legs. I went with a simple butt joint here, even though the end grain to face grain joint won't be very strong, but because of the way they attach to the main legs, it isn't going to matter. I think you'll see what I mean later. I also used two different clamping methods for each side. The first, I hadn't got the tapers on the narrow ends, but then I cut them in between for some unknown reason. But the second side, I just used some simple 90-degree clamping jigs that I had laying around. At this point, I gave all of the parts a good sanding. I figured this was the best time to do it to avoid any possible issues later after more of it was assembled. And now we've reached my favorite part. The chamfers! Okay, to do these, I set up a makeshift router table using just a slab of MDF, mounting the router to the bottom of it with a hole in the middle, and then I screw that to my workbench. And this gave me a really wide, flat surface to run each of the pieces smoothly across the bit. Now, I love these chamfers, but I wanted to keep them to a minimum so they're more of a feature, so the treatment was only given to each of the seat sides and the lower leg and stretcher assembly. Next, I glued the seat sides to the main legs. You can see here that I drew some guidelines to help with alignment, but as I went along, I can't say that they were particularly helpful. I ended up using a piece of scrap to make sure things were aligned properly, and my lines were pretty far off in the end. But, I mean, at least they gave me a general idea of where the glue should be. In hindsight, I feel that I should have devised a jig for this glue up, because they did come out slightly off from each other. Now, it's not enough to cause any problems, but if you happen to replicate the design, it is definitely something to consider. For this next stage in the assembly, I used this piece on the left as a guide to align the ends of each leg, and then I marked where they met. This just gave me a clear idea of where the glue should go, and this time around it was actually helpful, unlike last time. So earlier I mentioned that the butt joints on the first glue up wouldn't matter, and here you can kind of see why. Both the leg and the stretcher have long grain to long grain glue contact with the main leg, and this is much stronger, so it should keep the other joints from experiencing any stress. At least, that's the idea. So, and this is why you see me using a clamp in both directions on this joint. I want to make sure that each of those parts are as strongly connected as possible. After that was out of clamps, I moved right on to a little bit of filling with some wood putty. There wasn't a lot to do, thankfully, so I was also able to get right to the final sanding. The trick with this was to use a rigid block to make sure that I didn't round over the chamfers at all, to make sure that the next step, which is masking the chamfers, just a little bit easier. Wanted to keep those lines as crisp as possible. I also hit all the corners that aren't chamfered with some 220 grit just to soften the feel without compromising the contrast between the two edge treatments. The next day I decided it was time for some dowel holes. Now the process here is pretty straightforward. Once I had determined the placement and spacing, I just marked the centers and grabbed my 1/2 inch Forstner bit and got to it. Now this would be far better done with a drill press, but I don't have one, so I just did my best to keep the holes as square as straight as I could, and it came out pretty well. After going through this process for each of the holes, I did a little touch-up sanding, then gave the entire piece a good wipe down with mineral spirits to remove the fine dust before I moved on to the first stage of finishing. Because I chose to use spray paint, I first needed to mask the chamfers. To get the line between the black faces and the chamfers crisp and clean, I would place the tape firmly on the chamfer and then run a razor blade along the edge of the face. The results from this method were spectacular. Now it's important that the tape stick firmly to the masked areas, so be sure that they are clean and that you use a quality tape if you try it. The process was a bit time consuming, but the results were well worth the effort. After letting the paint set, but not fully cure, I peeled back the tape to get a look at the result. Man, this was sure satisfying. Once the paint was fully cured, I glued in the dowels. I think my holes didn't end up completely straight though, because it required a lot of force to get them in. Thankfully, using a block to hit with a rubber mallet did the trick and they went in without any damage to the finish. At least until I had to cut off the excess. I had planned on this happening, so I just did the least damage possible while cutting and then did a quick sanding and paint touch up. This next stage may seem a bit out of place, but that's because this is when I finally settled on the upholstery and top structure. So here I'm making what I'm calling the upper stretcher. For this, I matched the angles of the seat sides to the top and bottom, cut it to length, painted it, drilled some pocket holes, and finally installed it. I also added another lateral support for the seat as far toward the narrow end of the seat sides as possible. And now with the structure complete, I finished the chamfers with some paste wax. And as a final touch to the body, I put in these L brackets to mount the seat. I wanted the seat to just be lightly padded so it can double as a side table, so I opted to use 2 layers of this thin foam. After I had cut the backerboard for it, I traced it onto the foam and then cut 2 pieces exactly to size. Then I put out a drop cloth and used some spray glue to adhere 1 layer to the board and the second layer to the first layer. I then added a thin layer of polyester wrap, gluing it in place as well. I then trimmed the wrap so it didn't add any bulk to the bottom of the board. And then I cleared the table. If you notice on the right, I added 2 strips of foam to the bottom of the board on this one end. This is so that there's a bit of a bump to hide the staples and give it a cleaner look when it's complete. Now, as far as the upholstery process goes, I'll just stick with my usual advice here. Just take your time, keep your tension in mind, and play around with the corners until you find a look that you're comfortable with. Now, this being my first time using real leather in an application like this, I just don't feel qualified to say much else. It's like most things. You only learn if you try. So, just try. Now that the seat is ready, it's time to attach it. This was a pretty tight fit because the leather was thicker than I had accounted for, but I got it in and secured it with the brackets. Then I used this dust cover to hide all the messy bits under here. This was kind of tricky and I should have planned a better way to attach it, but I managed to get it in place. And do you know what that means? To say I'm happy with the finished product would be a huge understatement. I really enjoyed revisiting this design and giving it the justice it deserved. Now if you liked it, maybe hit like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.